Hello, everybody, and welcome to Hopkins at Home. My name is Peter Schechter. I'm both a Homewood graduate as well as a SAIS graduate, and Teja Ivanovic, who is with me here. We're delighted to host this episode of Hopkins at Home, and we're also particularly delighted to be joined by a very, very special guest. Professor Vali Nasr is the Majid Khadouri Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. And until 2019, Vali was the dean at SAIS and the first immigrant dean of SAIS. And in tonight, we're going to roam around a lot of issues, but we're going to leave time for questions at the end. I'm going to take just a moment to introduce Teja and myself. Teja graduated from SAIS in 2015 and has worked at the Center for Transatlantic Relations and at a financial communications firm working with long-term impact investors. She was also the correspondent for Oslobodzenia, one of the leading newspapers from the Balkans. My own career spanned US government, political consulting and elections all over the world. And then I was the founding director for the Atlantic Council's Latin America program for a good number of years.
And just to prove that, SAIS provides a lot of professional opportunities that range very widely. Peter and I right now are running and are partners at a restaurant called Immigrant Food. And on March 13th, we're actually doing a DIY cook-along with Hopkins at Home, and we will teach you how to make Venezuelan arepa. So I encourage you all to sign up. But Immigrant Food is much more than a restaurant, and it's a very SAIS-y place. So it's also a platform for advocacy on behalf of immigrants. We partner with 5 local immigrant service NGOs where we educate and advocate on behalf of immigrants. We share our space with immigrants. So actually right now where we are, Peter and I, this is the space we donate to our NGO partners. And you also, as a customer, can come in and sign up to volunteer, sign petitions, join initiatives on immigration. We also publish a monthly publication called The Think Table. That's a play on think tanks, where we slice and dice, to use sort of food metaphors, one issue on immigration a month. And you can follow us on social media at Immigrant Food, join our website and join our newsletter on there. And today we're very excited, not only because I'm able to talk with my former dean at SAIS. When I was at SAIS, Vali Nasr was the dean, but we're also going to be talking about a wide-ranging conversation, the bridging of some important issues and how higher education can train the future leaders to work in business that really promotes social justice and social equity. And also where the US immigration debate is going, and how immigration affects politics in the world, because it's not just the US issue. And then finally, we'll also ask Professor Nasr some questions about the Middle East, in which he's a world-renowned expert.
Thank you.
So Vali, thank you for joining us. And my first question is really sort of what happened after you stepped down as Dean of SAIS in 2019. Things really took a turn. Once you were gone, we've had a pandemic that exposed the deep inequities in societies around the world, especially in the United States. We've had massive BLM protests. We had a historic election and then an insurrection at the Capitol. And with this new reality in mind, how does higher education better prepare the leaders of tomorrow, and what needs to change?
Well, let me first start by saying how delighted I am to be at this event, to have been invited here, and to also meet Teja after a long time. I met her at SAIS, but it's good to see her, and also meet Peter, and also to be introduced to what is a SAIS enterprise. In other words, 2 SAIS alumni from different generations, really taking up an issue that at various sides of it reflects what SAIS is all about. We, as you said, we live in very trying times, and in a way, our world has been turned upside down. Some of the tumult that we are seeing at various stages has been compared to what happened with the Great Influenza at the beginning of the 20th century, the end of World War I. We're seeing major disruptions to daily lives of Americans, people around the world. And it came at a time, I think, where there was some degree of crisis in higher education in America. Why go to school? Why learn complex degrees like the one SAIS offers? But everything we've seen, is suggestive that our world is not getting simpler. It's getting more complex. It's getting more complicated. There are things that we didn't think of as international affairs that now are international affairs. And vice versa, international affairs, for instance, matters to a lot of things like, let's say, healthcare, which was not an international subject. So I think expertise, solid knowledge, understanding, not just facts, but also understanding, analysis, are more important than ever before. And I want to say also that as the United States is trying to rebuild post-Trump era, it needs educated young people to be committed, but also to have the knowledge to go forward.
Let me just go down a little bit further down that road. I mean, I remember when I was at SAIS, and I know because Taya and I have discussed it a lot, she was at SAIS a lot earlier than I was. But when we both were at SAIS, I mean, SAIS prided itself on, the business and economics aspects. And I guess let's widen it beyond just SAIS itself. I mean, how does higher education now encourage students to try to take on a repairing of the world, a social justice aspect that I think somehow needs to be woven into higher education in ways that perhaps it hadn't been woven into enough earlier?
I mean, very true. There are ethical, moral issues at the global level, and then there are now ethical and moral issues within our country as well. And I'm not going to speak about, let's say, schools that teach public policy, et cetera, because our experience is with a School of International Affairs. But even in my last year, from the students, I would hear that we study conflict in the Congo. Why aren't we studying conflict in America? Like we're studying conflict resolution, which is a very popular topic at SAIS. Well, so why aren't we studying it in America? And now actually we're in a very interesting place, whether you look at the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, social divisions. We're dealing with a host of political, ethical issues that we need to weave into our foreign policy. The rest of the world expects us to speak to that. But we're also dealing with a host of social justice issues globally, whether it's climate, whether it's vaccine equity, whether it's economic justice, these issues are prevalent out there. So a school like SAIS, and I would like to think Johns Hopkins as a whole, has to think about higher education as how do you prepare people to deal with these ethical issues and be able to weave that into whatever it is that they're going to be doing going forward.
Hey, let me bring you into the discussion because you've had, you worked in the finance industry. You were working for investors and funds that had to look at changing. Talk a little bit about that.
Right. So, I mean, my previous job before this SAIS adventure was in the PR industry of finance. And so we represented long-term investors that were specializing in ESG or impact investing. And, I've seen that industry also grow just in the few short years that I was there, and it's been growing for decades before it. And one big change was that there's no longer what they call passive investing in just excluding from your portfolio companies that are, tobacco companies or companies that invest in oil refineries or things like that, but just really actively searching out companies that do well in, ESG, which is, environmental, social, governance factors. And I think that is also what we do here, right, at Immigrant Food. Right. And so I think, 2 points on that really for me has been, big companies do this. You look at Nike, you look at Patagonia, you look at all these big billion-dollar companies that invest or take part of their profits and donate it to a social justice cause. But I also think that, we try to take it a step beyond and really integrate the cause or bake it in, to use another food term, into our business model. And instead of just donating money, It's really working with NGOs day to day and integrating them in our daily life as a restaurant. And then second, also, I think that it shouldn't just be billion-dollar companies that do this. I mean, it should also be small and medium-sized companies that are doing this day in, day out before they hopefully become really big. So I think it's everywhere, and especially with young people.
No, absolutely. I mean, we're obviously dealing with a generation of people for whom making the world a better place is more than a slogan. It's actually something they believe in, and they count. They think that the crises that we are facing are more important for them than it is for my generation. I mean, I know, for instance, my son, who's actually a first-year student at SAIS, reacted much more viscerally to the New York Times report about the world facing a major climate crisis in 2050, because I may think I may not even be there, but he definitely will. And so for him, for that generation, it matters a lot more. I think you raised two important issues that I think we grappled with this at SAIS a lot, and I think we took major steps. One is that, we like our education to be about not just teaching students specific things, but actually teaching them how to deal with complexity, right? You don't know what complexity is going to come your way once you get in the workforce, whether you're at the State Department, at the Pentagon, or you're in private business, or you're working on impact investing. And I think one of the qualities our students have, because of the fact that they live with many different kinds of classmates who are doing many different things, and they take a varieties of courses across disciplines, that they learn about how they weave things together. That's the advantage of somebody who went to SAIS to somebody who does MBA. Excuse me for anybody on the call who did that. But MBA trains, great professionals who are basically unidimensional in that sense, because they actually are not able to deal with the different sets of issues that might be political, social, etc. The second issue that I think you put your finger on, and it's very important to think about, is that a lot of businesses may think about race, diversity, climate, etc., essentially as risk management. In other words, we need to check the box here. We need to give this much money to refugees and this much money there, and we need to make sure that 30% of all our employees check a particular box. But I think businesses that really succeed, that figure out a way in which to integrate ethics into their business model in a way that is actually about excellence, not risk management, right? And that's a process. In other words, I don't think anybody has a great formula, but if you can come out and say that if I'm carbon neutral, if I recruit migrants, if I do these sorts of things, it actually makes me a better business. I learn more, I'm more versatile. And I think that's the kind of companies in the world that are going to do better. And, I think some professional higher educations in America don't train people to think like that. But we do. And I would like to think that, that actually puts SAIS at the forefront in the direction in which the world is going. And you too, and your business model is a great example of the way to think about a business that sees integrating an important ethical issue as something that will make it more excellent.
That's such an interesting point, Vali, and I'm grateful for those words. Can I go back to your son for 1 second? Because
sure.
You made a great point of sort of how the issues need to have relevance. But I have two daughters, more or less the age of your son, and what I find is this enormous mistrust in government that exists among younger generations. I mean, the government has, we've done the government route and it hasn't worked, and it's created a lot of the problems that we have today. I'm paraphrasing what somebody would say. We today have massive inequity in the delivery of government services that just don't get to people. I mean, the pandemic has exposed how government service just don't get to people who are the neediest. And, I think that it places into question the whole Friedmanian model of capitalism, that only shareholders, that's all we have to care about. And we have to move to a stakeholder economy in which we have to be much more cognizant of our community and the community issues. And I think it's an ethical choice, as you so well put, but it's also a business choice, because I think the wonderful thing about having, I hope you share this with me, about having millennial children is the fact that millennials really are determined to put their wallets where their beliefs are. Mm-hmm. And they will boycott some businesses and go to other businesses because of fundamental a sense of whether these businesses really are upholding some authentic values that are important.
Right. No, I agree with you. I mean, I don't think the millennials have figured out how to fix this. They identified the problem. They ultimately will have to embrace a form of government. But I think, you know, we're beginning to have this conversation in America, particularly since Black Lives Matter came to the fore. Our system is so broken because it's unethical. It's not unethical because it's capitalistic. It's unethical because it's racially biased. I mean, if you basically think it's okay for not just a class of people in terms of wealth, the way you might see it in other parts of the world, but a class of people based on the color of their skin should get better healthcare, should get better justice system, should get better services. I mean, just look at what happened in Houston last week, right? Yeah. It's the colored communities that are least given service to, and as a consequence suffer more. But what we haven't figured out that this comes back and bites you. In other words, even the wealthy cannot be immune when everything breaks down, when crime breaks down, when COVID happens. If you don't give vaccination to poor people who happen to be African American and Latino, that puts you in danger because ultimately you're going to come into contact with them. So we're for the first time are having a conversation about the fact that it's not just economic equity, it has to be racial equity, it has to be these other sets of issues. It will make American government better. It doesn't serve all the problems, but there are parts of American system that's broken exactly because it's been built on only enfranchising one segment of the population.
Right. And I think it's also been racially biased for that reason, because it's so focused just on shareholders, right? It's not focused on the wider society. I mean, when you look at businesses, they only look at, the bottom line without anything else. I mean, when we look at our financial data, we don't just look at the bottom line. We also say, okay, how much have we done for the community this month, and how much more can we integrate the NGO partners? And I think that, with younger people, and it's millennials, but it's also Gen Xers, right? It's our interns here at Immigrant Food. I mean, they were the loudest when all the BLM protests were going on. And so I think it's continuing to put that pressure on each other, and and keeping our each other accountable for that too.
That's right.
Let me take, I think what Vali said just now is a great segue to move on to another certainly underserved, underrepresented, and in the last 4 years made a scapegoat for all ills, which namely are immigrants and immigration. We at Immigrant Food, we constantly remind people that immigrants have been the engine of the U.S. economy and continue to be the engine of the U.S. economy. They are the secret sauce of our unique blend of culture. They're, we're all immigrants, certainly, unless you are a Native American or unless your forefathers and ancestors were brought here forcibly from Africa. And immigrants today make up 40% of America's science Nobel Prizes since the year 2000. They make up 25% of all US science tech workers. They make up 55% of America's billion-dollar startups. Each one of those have an immigrant founder: Microsoft, Google, Tesla, Uber, Oracle. And so you were the first immigrant dean of SAIS. I'd love you to share your own immigrant story, but I want you also to ponder a little bit, why has this become such a divisive issue in America?
Well, my family came to America in 1979 after the Iranian Revolution, and I didn't go back for decades. They settled here. So we were in those days, they called them political refugees or exiles, but in a sense, we were immigrants. We were fortunate that we were educated, could go to school, could settle in much faster, but also America was more hospitable to migrants, I think, even in 1979 when I came, than it is today. I felt, particularly during the Trump years, personally, even when I was dean, that the mood is changing. I never thought of myself that self-consciously as a migrant, but increasingly came to feel that way. I mean, it's sort of, before that you would feel anti-Islamic feeling, but you associated that not with migrants per se, but with 9/11. It was more about, that political trend. But I remember the day that Trump said to Ilhan Omar, the congresswoman, if you're not happy, you ought to go back where you came from. That really sort of resonated with me, that in a negative way, in a sense that I even felt that, it was time to move on from where I was sitting as a dean and become engaged in the elections, et cetera, because basically what it said is that there's another America which we hadn't seen, or maybe we dismissed, which sees America not in terms that you mentioned, Peter, but sees America the way Europeans might see their country. In other words, this is a country for white Americans, and everybody else here is a guest, the way maybe Germans might think about Turks, for instance, or others, that we're not all immigrants the way you put it. We're not all, this is not a cosmopolitan society. This is a country built by whites for whites. And no one, and others don't really have a right of membership in America. They have a technical legal status which can be taken away from them. And that's sort of, there are times in your life where, you get zinged, if you would, with certain things you see. The kind of comfort that I think my generation felt coming to America as being integrated and being secure here was greatly disturbed by Trump. And I don't think that, yes, it's great that we have a new president, but the underlying sets of issues haven't gone away. Now, why has America become so concerned with this, and why is it reacting this way is peculiar. I used to live in California before I moved to Washington. And I remember when NAFTA was happening, California was up in arms because it was said that it was going to be majority Mexican. Some activists would say things to annoy the Anglos, like, we're reconquering California, and that. But in some ways, California found its peace with migrants. That's not the place that really embraced Trump and its violence against migrants. It's sort of, but the rest of America is where, let's say, California was in the 1990s. And it's a struggle. I think, I was born in a, different country, you or Teo was, but my children, your children are born here. They sort of have a sense of ownership to this country. And I think the issue of migrants is going to be a huge issue for America in a major way.
But what I think is fascinating is that actually it's a politically divisive issue, but only for politicians, because poll after poll shows you that Americans, by and large, support immigration. There was a 2020 Gallup poll, the most recent Gallup poll on immigration, which showed the highest number of support for Americans who think immigration should actually increase. And that was the highest number since Gallup started doing these polls in 1965.
What was the number?
It was 34% of Americans think that immigration should actually increase, like we should have more immigration. And I think that's fascinating because I agree with you. There's obviously these pockets in America where I think politicians use to show, right? It's a very loud minority of people who are actually against immigration. And this is not an issue just in America, right? Peter was born in Italy. I'm from Europe. I was born in Belgium. And obviously there in Europe, we've seen a lot of issues with migration patterns. And so actually I have a question for you, Vali. You are such a Middle East expert. Can you explain, because a lot of that migration to Europe is coming from the Sahel, from the Middle East, Syria. What is causing some of those migration patterns over there?
So I mean, you're right. I mean, in Europe, this is a much bigger issue because the numbers are larger, and also Europe's own sort of core population is declining because of lower fertility rates. And so there is really a fear of extinction, if you want to call it, in Europe. And unfortunately, Europe is sitting, if you would, right along an arc that is collapsing around it. And although all of its attention has been internal on the Greek debt crisis and on Brexit, etc., it's actually in some ways the larger issues around it. So partly it is the demographic time bomb around it. I mean, if you look at the arc from Turkey all the way to North Africa and the Sahel, populations are 60-70% are considered youth. The economies are not growing. There's not investment in them. They're not job producing. There is a sort of an economic push for them to go towards richer economies and go to Europe. There's also now a climate issue. The desert is expanding southwards and northwards by miles every year. It's creating fresh migrants, is disrupting agriculture and production, etc. And then you have conflict. You have conflict that is born on economics. You have conflicts that are born of wars. The Arab Spring produced collapse in Libya. It produced collapse in Syria. And you now have a crisis brewing in Lebanon. And each one of these wars produces new refugees that are escaping. A lot of the refugees stay local, but some of them get on boats and they try to find their ways to Europe. And there's the fear that this is becoming a deluge that Europe cannot handle is actually increasing. And some of that politics also spills over to the United States. As we know, there is relationships between populist parties across the continent. Some of the language flows over. I mean, people like Steve Bannon were simultaneously active in Italy as they were in the US, and this was about the defense of Christendom, right? The Holy Roman Empire against these hordes of barbarians coming over the Mediterranean.
Right, and I think climate change also. You mentioned it, and I'm sure your son, if he's watching, this is also what we read in the great New York Times piece. I mean, by the year 2050, so he might be more interested in that than you, Vali. I don't know, but I mean, we're going to have 143 million climate migrants, and by 2070, I think we're going to have 3 billion people that live in places that are unsuitable for human life.
Right.
Right. And so, I mean, what are we going to do about that? Those people will migrate. There will be migration within the United States as well. I mean, there will be parts of the United States that will become unsuitable for human life. And I think that's a conversation that needs to be had as well. And I think education is huge on that, because I think, those people that are so fervently against immigration, I don't know if they truly understand what that entails.
No, I mean, absolutely. You mentioned, we forget that in the United States in the 1930s and 40s, there was a mass migration of African Americans from the South to the North. And it brought diversity. It changed the picture in America. The problem is we think of migration as an on-off switch, that you either have it or you don't have it. It's going to be, as you said, it's going to be a reality. We have to learn how to manage it, and how to take advantage of it, and how to minimize, the kinds of shocks that it can give to the systems in different parts of the world.
Yeah, and I was just looking up here. I grabbed my phone and I looked up that poll that Thea mentioned. It's amazing. 8 out of 10, 80% of Americans see immigration as fundamentally a good thing in this Gallup poll. I mean, the numbers are incredible, and it goes back to what you said about Europe. I mean, it's a vastly different question if you ask a European, because I think the integration problem of a declining white society in Europe and growing immigrant problems, most of whom perhaps are not of the same religion, etc. How do you see Europe managing this integration?
Especially in France, right, with laïcité and everything around that.
Well, I think there's going to be ultimately a tipping point where these societies will have to give, or that the migrants will begin to participate in the political order, and the change ultimately will have to come at that point. You're beginning to see that in England, where there are people running in parliament, et cetera, who are of Indian, Pakistani, Arab origin. But United States has an advantage that it has always had an openness to different religions and different views, and that sort of Jeffersonian separation of church and state created a religious pop sphere in America where you didn't need to belong to a state religion in order to function. But in Europe, it's going to be much, much more difficult. I mean, sustaining democracy, as the case of laïcité in France suggests, whereas actively trying to disenfranchise a different group, or to demand of them that they basically completely change a lot of sets of issues, it's going to be conflictual. I'm not going to say there's a right and wrong here, but it's not a path that is going to be negotiated through elections, et cetera. And it's fraught with a great deal of difficulty. And I would just say one other issue is that the examples of the kinds of things you're doing is very rare in Europe, right? Of actual activities that are trying to create this kind of a relationship. I mean, in Europe is much more that exceptional, migrants are exceptional, like the Turkish couple that pioneered the Pfizer vaccine. But when something is wrong, much like the way Trump thinks, then the migrants own it. So a murder in a poor neighborhood is characteristic of migrants, but innovation and breakthrough is not characteristic of them. It's exceptional to them. And I think projects like yours help break that sort of mental compartmentalization of how you see migrants.
And I remember when I was talking to my dad, who's in Europe, about immigrant food. I mean, he said, well, that's a great idea, but that would never work in Europe. And it's exactly to your point, which is unfortunate. And in Belgium, I see it firsthand, right? I mean, the communities where there are a lot of migrants are often the ones that are sort of labeled for good reason or not, are labeled, the bedrocks of terrorism and et cetera. And I think there's just not enough conversation, but not enough engagement with them
Well, even terrorism in Europe, I think, focusing on Islam per se and laïcité as an example misses the point. Majority of these most violent terrorists have never been to anywhere in the Muslim world. But they're also not accepted or integrated into the society in which they were born. They don't belong anywhere. And so it's very easy for them to be attracted to terrorist organizations that promise them, some kind of a social solution. The two Algerian brothers who attacked Charlie Hebdo and killed 20-some people to start with, neither one of them spoke Arabic, had never been to Algeria, didn't know anything about Islam before they went to prison. They were two basically petty thieves. But France had never sort of embraced them as French, and they didn't belong in Algeria. So in a way, they were even refugees in a sense that is more than just somebody who's just arrived, or their parents were refugees. They really don't belong anywhere. And if France or Europe or the United States wants to avoid that, you have to find a way to integrate people, so they have a cultural, social home that they feel they belong to society. Otherwise, they have no stakes in it. And it'd be very easy for them to embrace acts of violence.
And I think the US has an opportunity there, because the US has always embraced immigrants. The US has always been a multicultural society. And, the point that you brought up, which is fascinating, is the voting, right? And how immigrants are becoming a huge part of the voting population, as well as politicians that are running. And actually the Think Table that I mentioned, the publication we do here at Immigrant Food, we did a whole piece on voting and how immigrants are changing. the voting population. And I mean, now we see even with Kamala Harris, right? I mean, the first VP Asian, from East Asia. And we did, I don't know if you can see it here, but we did a whole infographic that, 11 out of the 24 cabinet members, Biden's cabinet members, are immigrants or children of immigrants. And I think that will change the conversation by itself.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, I need to leave sometime because I know the people who are listening in want to hear some thoughts on the Middle East. So I'm just going to, Vali, if it's okay, I'm just going to fire away
Please.
with a couple of questions. Give us your insights. Is America going to go back to the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran? What will it take for the Biden administration to get back in?
I think that's the intention, not only because this was a deal that was the legacy of President Obama and many people in the Biden administration actually negotiated it, but I think because it's logical for America. We're suffering from COVID. We're internally divided. Our economy is in a bad shape. We're signed up now for a major confrontation with China. Do we really want to spend another $1 trillion, $2 trillion on another war and 500,000 troops in the Middle East? I don't think so. And there's not bipartisan opposition on both wings of the party, of both Republican and Democratic Party, to involvement in the Middle East. Now, the most likely reason why the United States might end up in a war in the Middle East is Iran's nuclear program. And so taking that off the table, at least the likelihood of Iran being nuclear right away, is a logical thing. So I think the inclination is to go back to the deal, get Iran to abide by it. You would have to give them something in terms of sanctions relief to get that. Now, intention doesn't mean that it's going to work, because sometimes you can trip over yourself. You might think too much about the Congress, or you might make a wrong step. The devil, as you learned at SAIS, is a lot of times in the detail. It's the actual negotiation that has to succeed. So until they're in, things can go wrong in a major way. Somebody may miscalculate. But I think the United States is moving in that direction. And it's part of the grand strategy of the Biden administration. It's not about Iran alone.
Let me ask the reverse question. Is Iran wanting the United States to go back?
Yes, but the Iranians are the smaller party here. They're the ones who suffered more. They're once bitten, twice shy. They're worried that the U.S. may corner them somehow, come back in and then not lift sanctions, or find other excuses to keep sanctions. Or what if in 4 years' time you have another version of Trump back? I mean, you also not only have to trust this administration, you have to trust the United States. And that's something we don't talk about a lot, is that most of the world used to think of the United States as Mount Everest. As you know, it really didn't change. And now that it's changed, you really have to worry what's going to happen 4 years from now. So for us, Iran is one problem. For Iran, the United States is everything, just as it is for China, for Korea. So the Iranians are very suspicious. They obviously would like to get back to some kind of normalcy. But again, they have to get out of their own way to find their way back into a right place.
Let me move to Lebanon, a country which is so important because of its geographic location, but it is in such a difficult situation, both economically. You have a state within a state with Hezbollah. You have a government that has proven itself repeatedly to be ineffective, corrupt. Is Lebanon fixable?
Not easily. The reason is, Lebanon, you could say, worked for a while based on a ceasefire that was agreed to end the civil war in 1975. The Civil War 75. Sometimes, peace deals are good. You could say that about Dayton Agreement as well, and Bosnia, that they're good in the sense that they end the fighting, but they're not necessarily good in terms of where you go from there. And Bosnia similarly has not really found its way. So generally, this is a country in which the distribution of power is fraught. Distribution of wealth is fraught. It's a country that the last census was taken close to a century ago. There's not even a consensus about taking a census and finding out really what portion of the population belongs to what identity group. It's a country that's weak, cannot keep outsiders, whether it's Iran, Israel, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Syria, out of its borders. And then it's got into a very bad place because, as you said, Hezbollah has become very powerful. It's become a state within a state. And then on top of it, you've had a war next door in Syria, which has brought something close to 2 million refugees into Lebanon, which is a very high portion of the population. But also, much more important, Lebanon's economy cannot really work without it being the trade access point to the interior. If the interior's economy is gone, so why exactly would Lebanon's coastal economy function? So it almost has a Trieste problem. When Trieste was separated from the rest, then the city collapsed because without the interior, the city doesn't function. So that's another problem. Then the third one is that corruption has become rampant, and the system in Lebanon worked by the banks giving cheap credit for anybody to convert their money into, even keep dollar accounts in Lebanese banks. And as happened in Argentina at one point, it becomes a Ponzi scheme, and at some point it collapses. So everybody's savings in the banks was gone. You had this massive bombing that happened. And then the Trump administration also was not keen on helping Lebanon economically because it hoped that choking Lebanon would kill off Hezbollah. So the country is in a bad place, let's say. And there is no regional consensus to help it. And there's not an easy path to say, how would you get Iranians, Saudis, Israelis, Turks, et cetera, to agree? How do you get the internal power brokers to agree to a new arrangement in Lebanon in order to rebuild the country? And then how do you get Syria back on its feet in a way that it could support a Lebanese trading economy?
Yeah, and Vali, you mentioned the Dayton Agreement and Trieste, and I'm itching to talk about Balkan politics, but that's maybe for another time. I know we have a couple minutes before we move to questions, so if the audience, if you guys have questions, please write them in the chat and we'll ask them. But just one last question on the Middle East also is the Abraham Accords. Valia, we'd love your thoughts on that and what's the importance of it and what's next?
Well, it's very important in the sense that it broke a major taboo for having Arabs and Israelis get together. It also is very important because I think it proved, at least for now, the thesis that Prime Minister Netanyahu operated on. In other words, he does not need to choose between peace with the Palestinians and recognition from Arabs. He can have both. He can, no, in other words, he can have Palestinian land and build settlements and annex Golan Heights and parts of Jerusalem and yet have Arab recognition. So that's also a major turning point. But ultimately, this is not about Arabs and Israelis. This peace deal is about Iran and Turkey, who are becoming big forces in the region. So it's essentially created a new axis in the Middle East between UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Israel against Iran and its clients and against Turkish incursions into the Middle East. And ironically, the senior partner in this deal, I think, is Israel. Because one of the reasons the Arab countries, UAE, et cetera, went to Israel is because they know the United States may be leaving the region. They're looking for somebody else to provide them with security that the US may not. So it's significant on multiple levels. The question is, can it be expanded? I don't think as easily, because the Trump administration really gave fantastic deals to countries to come in, like Morocco can have the Western Sahara if it agreed, or Sudan will be off the terrorism list with a stroke of the pen and have this many billions of dollars if it's signed. I don't think the Biden administration will be willing to give these kinds of one-offs. So I think the deal is there to stay, but it's not going to necessarily engulf the rest of the Arab world very quickly.
So Taylor, we should move to questions, right?
Yeah.
I'm gonna let you chair that part.
Absolutely. We have a lot of questions. I'm not sure we'll get to everything. And there's some great questions about all of the things that we discussed. I mean, this last part was so fascinating. Peter has a podcast called Altamar. It's an international affairs podcast, and he needs to have you on, Vali, to talk about.
Anytime. Be happy to join the Science Mafia at any point.
Love it. Okay, so we have a question from Olivia. What is a big idea related to immigration policy that you see as an opportunity for the new administration?
Well, I think they've already chosen the big idea, and that is a pathway to citizenship. And I don't think they worked the details, but they threw it out there as a way of organizing the rest of the conversation around this concept, that there's an 8-year or a 10-year pathway that could get the 11 million, quote unquote, undocumented migrants in the United States citizenship. So I think that's the big idea. That's right now is the one that the administration will probably sink its teeth into.
Can I just add to that? I think comprehensive immigration reform in the United States continues to fail. And they tried it, John McCain tried this to bring what's called the Gang of Eight together. And, it failed about 10 years ago enormously, mostly because Republicans in the House refused to let it pass. There is a sense among the Biden administration, among specialists in immigration, that we are at a very particular moment in which we have to find a way to take the dynamite out of this issue, and some type of comprehensive immigration reform which combines a path to citizenship with some ways to more secure, in particular, the U.S. southern border, is seen as more possible today than ever before. But this, of course, is going to depend a lot on how the next few months goes in terms of whether Republicans, and in particular Trump, who is speaking next Sunday to CPAC, the conservative movement, whether they are going to again choose this issue as the fundamental issue to divide Democrats and Republicans.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many, right? I mean, one thing that I'm actually really excited to see how they are going to tackle is immigration court reform, which I think is such an important part of the whole system, right? Because when Republicans attack it, they always say, immigrants, they don't show up, right? It's catch and release, they don't show up to their court hearings, which is actually not true. I mean, the numbers show that is not the case.
That's
but
right.
It is the case that we need comprehensive reform in courts with judges, and just we need a more streamlined process.
That's right.
We can talk about that, but I need to move on to the next question. So again, these will sort of go about, we covered a lot of topics. So what are some ways, this is from Angelica, what are some ways that founders of startups can implement the community piece and socially responsible components into their businesses at the early stages? Any resources? That's a good question.
That's such a good question. I mean, I think the key to this is to have a clear concept, right? I mean, we are passionate about the immigration space for so many reasons, in part because we're all immigrants. My parents were immigrants. Tea calls herself an immigrant squared. Her parents moved from the former Yugoslavia to Belgium. She was born and grew up in Belgium. Now she moved to the United States, so she's an immigrant squared. So, but I think you have to have a clear concept of what you want to do and how you want to engage. We didn't want to engage by simply taking like a percentage of our profits and giving it to somebody. We wanted to engage. We wanted the whole thing to be about immigration, the food to be about immigration, the cause to be about immigration. So we created a educational component, an advocacy component, a food component to do about education, and then a event component as well, which we've had more difficulty doing in the cold part of COVID than we have in the warmer part of COVID, because we did do some events outside. But of course, in the cold, we can't do that, and we can't do them inside yet, I hope. So it really is, to me, about having a clarity of concept of how you want to have a social justice component of an enterprise that is both about making profit and hiring people and hiring immigrants, but also about sort of doing good in the world.
And also, if I can just add to that, it's partnerships. I think that was really key for us because, yes, we have, some background, some knowledge about immigration. Yes, we're very passionate about it, but, we're not experts. There's plenty of people out there that know this issue much better than we do, whether it's on the advocacy side or whether it's, on the expert on the policy side. And so we were lucky that, the 5 NGOs that we reached out to that we wanted to partner with, they wanted to partner with us as well. And we learned from them so much. We reach out to them about different issues, about different ways that we can help them. I mean, when we went to them, we asked them, right, Peter, I mean, what's the best way that we can help you? What do you need most? And so they said, aside from money, which of course we need volunteers and we need space. And so we thought then we went back and went to the drawing board of how can we integrate that? And so we came up with what we call this engagement menu of where, our customers can, choose, they can choose their bowl or their sandwich, but they can also choose a way to engage with the community. And that changes every week. So if you're interested in that, also just go to our website, immigrantfood.com, and sign up to our newsletter. Every Saturday we send that over. And also on the policy side, we are lucky to partner with some great minds in immigration that help us think through issues that we will present in the think table. So I think partnerships are really key. If you figure out, the topic, the issue you care about, and then start reaching out to the communities, you're surprised how many people want to partner with you.
Interesting.
Okay, moving on from Bernard. What are the long-term impacts of the Muslim travel ban on the relationship between the U.S. and the Middle East? Vali, that's all you.
Well, it wasn't good. Let's put it that way. But actually, the Muslim ban affected disproportionately Iranians. About, I think, 45% of all the visas that were canceled right away when Trump announced it were Iranians. Interestingly, it's the class of Iranians that supposedly the Trump administration thinks are anti-regime and it would like to engage, who have pro-democratic feelings, who are pro-American. They're the ones who have kids in America and wanted to come and visit them, or there are students who are coming. So it actually left a very bad taste. It suggested that despite what it says, that the administration is not really supportive of the people, and it doesn't distinguish between regime and the population. But the way also this ban was understood around the Muslim world was seen as something which was anti them, and that it singled them out in some ways. So. I think, and I hope it's one of the things that the Biden administration should address quickly as part of its soft power initiatives.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. From Adnan, are you from Bosnia, or where are you from? The question is, how do we combat the message that immigrants are coming to the U.S. to take from Americans and remind Americans that we're all immigrants?
Well, I would say it's not enough to just say we're all immigrants, because sometimes that becomes a cliche sentence. It's actually to highlight what is the contribution of immigrants to as you said, to science, to technology, to the economy, to varieties of sorts of economic activity. I think the counter narrative is that the migrants don't take from America; they actually give a lot to America, and yes, of course, they get certain things, but this is a two-way relationship, as any social relationship ought to be.
And I think, arm yourself with facts, right? I mean, even undocumented immigrants contribute billions of dollars in taxes to the economy. So I think if you sort of arm yourself with some facts and talk to people, I think it's important to just really talk to people. I mean, we at the restaurant here sometimes have people with MAGA hats on, and you try to engage with people, and some people are receptive, and some people will listen to you, and then will take their time and maybe process it themselves and get out on the other end. I mean, I don't think we can't give up on everyone.
No, I definitely agree that we have to combat this with facts, with I mean, and the facts are so great, right? It's not only some of the facts as I mentioned earlier about Nobel Prizes. Look at our culture. Our culture, has become completely taken over by, not taken over, it has completely become enriched by so many different immigrant groups. And whether we are dancing salsa or listening to African music, I mean, you everywhere in every urban environment in America, you can find this plethora of cultural mix that I think is unique here. And even the pro-Trump anti-immigrant groups sometimes don't even know they are consuming immigrant culture every day.
Absolutely. There's some questions that are similar, so I'll combine because we're about 5 minutes out. From CM and from Deborah, your questions are similar. It's about what are your views on working with other countries to improve systems in those other countries so that people want to stay in their homes and invest in their own countries rather than flee in desperation?
Well, I mean, that was originally a logic behind NAFTA, that if you created jobs in Mexico, then there wouldn't be as much pressure to move to the United States. And I think for Europe, there's no way to stem the tide of migration from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, Sahel, North Africa to Europe unless you invest in creating jobs and a sustainable economy in Africa itself. So it goes without saying, but that's the missing piece, right? I think the solution that Trump has come up with is build a wall. In other words, just physically prevent people from coming. But we have an ocean, and maybe a wall may work, but Europe actually cannot sustain that model. So for them.
And I was just going to add, I mean, your point in terms of Mexico is that to a large extent, NAFTA worked. I mean, over the last 5 years, there has been a demigration of Mexicans from the United States back to Mexico, both because Mexico had more opportunities in a growing economy, which it doesn't have anymore because of the pandemic, but also because Mexicans had made money here and were returning back to Mexico, and where a large part of the migration in the United States were from Central American countries, particularly 3 Central American countries in the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, which were racked with violence and economic difficulties. And the Biden administration, this is something that Joe Biden knows a lot about. He was Barack Obama's chief Latin American person. And I mean, I think there were 26 trips that Joe Biden took as vice president to Latin America. And he really has spoken a number of times about the importance to invest and help those 3 Central American countries to right up their, both in terms of help them prop up their governments and improve governance, but also to create investments there that will allow people to stay in their home countries, make money, and stay with their families, which everybody wants to do. They don't want to leave. They feel they have to.
They can help it. Yeah, exactly.
All right, I think we have time for one last question. I'm sorry we can't get to all of your questions, which are really great. So from Allegra, what are the ways that the Trump administration has impacted relations in the Middle East for the next 10 to 20 years? Not an easy question to end with.
Well, I mean, Middle East was already having a great deal of difficulty, but he has actually broken down, if you would, a lot of systems that worked. And I think the most important thing that he created a problem with is that he both accelerated the move towards conflict, coming very close to war with Iran, but at the same time kept sending the message to the region that the United States is leaving. And so that kind of a psychosis has made the region much more volatile.
We're going to put you on the spot. Yeah. CNN is reporting right now that the U.S. military, I'm just reading this now, carried out airstrikes in Syria targeting an Iranian-backed militia site, the first known military action under Biden.
Yeah. So the tensions continue. Never a dull moment there. No, those are the dangers which I said at that may derail any intention about getting back on track with Iran. That is not part of the meta narrative, but may very well end up being decisive.
I think we're out of time. And Vali, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for all of you for joining Hopkins at Home. And it's been great for Taya and I to be part of this and to host you tonight.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thanks very much.